The chamber was silent in a way that felt heavier than sound. Rows of alien delegates sat in a wide circle, their forms different in shape, size, and color, yet all sharing the same cold attention. At the center stood the human delegation. They did not look powerful compared to the others. No glowing armor, no floating devices, no visible weapons. Just simple uniforms, worn from long travel, and tired eyes that had not slept properly in days. For years, tension had been building between humanity and the Galactic Council. It was never one single crime or mistake. It was a pattern the Council claimed they could no longer ignore. Humans expanded too quickly. They adapted too fast. They asked too many questions and refused too many limits. What humans called progress, the Council called instability. The final decision had already been made before the meeting even began. Everyone in the room knew it, even if it had not been spoken out loud yet. A senior council speaker finally rose. Its voice carried through the hall with mechanical calm, translated instantly into every known language. It listed charges against humanity: unauthorized expansion into restricted zones, uncontrolled industrial growth, refusal to comply with shared governance systems, and repeated conflicts with minor member species. Each word fell heavy, but the human delegation did not interrupt. They had learned that interruption here meant nothing. Decisions in this chamber were rarely changed. When the speaker finished, there was a long pause. Then the final ruling was announced. Humanity would be removed from the Galactic Council. All shared resources, navigation access, and protected trade routes would be revoked. Human colonies would no longer be recognized under Council law. Any systems currently occupied by humans would be marked as outside jurisdiction, meaning no protection, no support, and no political connection. In simple terms, humanity was being pushed out of the known order of civilized space. A faint murmur moved through the chamber, but the Council quickly silenced it. The decision was final. One of the human representatives stepped forward slightly. There was no anger in the movement, only exhaustion mixed with disbelief. The human spoke carefully, choosing words that would not be misunderstood. Without Council protection, many human colonies would struggle. Some would fail. Trade routes that supported millions of lives would collapse. Isolation on this scale had never been tested for a species still growing in interstellar travel. The human voice did not threaten or beg. It simply stated what would happen. But the Council did not show concern. They believed humanity was exaggerating. In their long history, they had exiled other civilizations before. Those species have faded away, absorbed back into obscurity, or reduced to small, isolated systems. The Council saw humans as similar, loud, ambitious, but ultimately dependent on larger structures to survive. The ruling was enforced immediately. Signals were cut across human-controlled space. Navigation permissions vanished from systems overnight. Automated Council fleets entered human border regions, not to attack, but to escort. It was a controlled removal, precise and cold. Human ships were guided away from core worlds, away from the dense trade lanes filled with advanced civilizations, and pushed toward the outer regions of the galaxy. These regions were poorly mapped, filled with unstable star systems, abandoned colonies, and resource-poor space that most species avoided. From the perspective of the Council, it was not cruelty, it was separation, a way to restore order. From the perspective of humanity, it was abandonment. On the final day of contact, messages were exchanged across fading channels. Some human colonies asked for reconsideration. Some asked for time. Others asked nothing at all, already focused on evacuation and survival planning. The Council did not respond. Then came the silence. Humanity was alone. Ships crossed the last control boundary into the outer rim. Behind them, the structured network of Council space dimmed like a distant city disappearing behind fog. Ahead lay darkness, scattered stars, and unknown systems that had never been mapped in detail. Inside human vessels, there was no celebration, no rebellion, no dramatic speeches. Only quiet coordination. Engineers checked systems. Pilots recalculated routes. Leaders studied failing maps and incomplete data. Everyone understood the same truth. Survival would no longer be supported by anyone else. As the escort fleets turned back, one final transmission was sent from Council Command. It was short, formal and emotionless. It confirmed the end of human membership and wished them acceptable outcomes in their independent development. Then even that channel went dark. For the first time in recorded history, an entire intelligent species was fully outside the structure of the Galactic Council. And in the empty stretch of the Outer Rim, humanity began to move forward without permission, without guidance, and without anyone watching closely enough to see what they would become. The Outer Rim did not look like a place meant for life at first glance. It was wide, quiet, and scattered with dead systems that had long been ignored by advanced civilizations. Stars here were dimmer in meaning, not in light. Trade routes did not pass through. Rescue signals were rare. Most species considered this region a slow end for anything that entered it. This was where humanity had been pushed. At first, panic spread across many human colonies. News of the exile reached systems at different speeds, and not all of them received it clearly. Some believed it was temporary. Others believed it was a mistake that would be corrected. A few thought it was political pressure that would soon fade. But when council ships left and no new messages came, reality became clear. There was no return. The early days were difficult. Supply chains broke down almost instantly. Many colonies depended on imports for advanced materials, medicine, and energy stabilizers. Without those, systems began to fail. Cities that once relied on steady support from central hubs were suddenly forced to survive on what they had. Fear spread, but something unexpected happened at the same time. People started adapting. The first real shift was communication. With council networks gone, human colonies built their own channels. At first, they were weak and unstable, but engineers worked day and night to connect distant worlds using relay satellites and improvised quantum links. Messages that once took seconds now took hours, but they still arrived, and that was enough. Then came resource sharing. Instead of competing, colonies began trading directly. A mining world that produced raw metals exchanged them for agricultural systems from a fertile colony. A research station shared medical data in return for energy components. Slowly, a new system of cooperation replaced the old dependency on external control. There was no central authority at first. Everything was fragile, improvised, and sometimes chaotic, but it was human-made. In the middle of this struggle, another change began quietly. The Outer Rim was not empty. It only looked empty from a distance. In reality, it held forgotten systems, abandoned stations, and ruins left behind by earlier civilizations that had either collapsed or moved deeper into council space. Most species ignored these places because they were considered unprofitable or unstable. Humans did not ignore them. Exploration teams started scanning nearby systems, not for conquest, but for survival. What they found changed everything. Some planets had rare minerals untouched for centuries. Some asteroid belts contained energy-rich cores that could power entire colonies. In several systems, old alien infrastructure still functioned at a basic level. Even if it had been abandoned long ago, human engineers studied everything carefully. Nothing was wasted. Even broken structures were dismantled and rebuilt into something useful. A fallen orbital platform became a refinery. A silent station became a research hub. Every discovery turned into opportunity. This shift gave humanity something it had lost during its years under council supervision: independence. On one of the larger human control clusters, a decision was made. Instead of waiting for a single leader or central government to form, colonies agreed on a simple structure. Emergency coordination councils were created in each system. Their purpose was not to rule, but to stabilize. Each system managed its own survival while sharing critical information with others. It was not perfect. Disagreements happened often. Some colonies wanted faster expansion, while others feared overextension. Some wanted isolation, while others pushed for deeper cooperation. But even with conflict, the structure held. Something else was changing too: the mindset of humanity itself. Under council rule, humans had always been judged, guided, or restricted. Every advancement was reviewed. Every expansion required approval. Now, there was no approval process. Every decision carried risk, but also freedom. That freedom pushed innovation forward faster than anyone expected. Engineers developed new propulsion methods, using modified rim materials. Scientists discovered energy patterns in dead star systems that had never been studied properly. Medical teams created treatments from biological samples found in abandoned alien habitats. Progress was no longer slow and controlled. It was fast, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous. But it was real. As months turned into years, stability began to grow. What started as scattered survival systems slowly formed a loose but connected network of human colonies across the outer rim. They were not an empire yet, not in the traditional sense, but they were no longer isolated survivors either. They had structure, they had communication, they had resources, and most importantly, they had direction. Far away from council-controlled space, unnoticed by most of the galaxy, humanity was beginning to change again, not into what it had been, but into something new. The early struggle for survival in the outer rim slowly turned into something far more unexpected. Humanity had entered the region as an exiled and weakened civilization, but time was changing that image in ways no one inside the Galactic Council had predicted. At first, human activity was still visible in scattered clusters. Small colonies worked hard to secure food, energy, and protection. Everything was built for survival, not expansion. But as systems stabilized, a quiet shift began. Humans started to think beyond the next crisis. They started to think ahead. There was no official order for expansion. No single leader gave instructions. Instead, it happened naturally, like water finding cracks in stone. Exploration ships moved farther from their home clusters, not with armies, but with engineers, scientists, and independent crews who understood one simple truth. The outer rim was large, and they had only seen a small part of it. What they found changed their understanding of exile completely. The region that the Council had dismissed as empty and useless was filled with forgotten value. Entire star systems contained abandoned stations that still had functioning systems buried under layers of decay. Some planets showed signs of previous industrial activity, long gone but not fully dead. There were structures built by unknown civilizations that the Council had never documented. Instead of fear, humans felt curiosity. Recovery teams were sent to study these places. They did not rush. Every discovery was examined carefully. Broken stations were not abandoned again. They were repaired, modified, and reused. A drifting supply hub became a mining control center. A silent communications array was rebuilt into a long-range relay system. Even damaged alien machinery was carefully taken apart, so its principles could be understood. Human engineers began to notice something important. Many of these old systems used simpler designs and council-level technology, but they were built with extreme durability. They were designed to survive without maintenance for centuries. This idea fascinated human researchers. Instead of chasing only advanced complexity, they began combining council-era knowledge with the reliability of older systems. This blend created a new kind of technology development. It was not the fastest or the most elegant, but it was practical and long-lasting. Ships became more efficient in deep space travel. Communication networks became more stable even in unstable regions. Energy systems were redesigned to work in environments where support could not be guaranteed. As human capability grew, so did their movement. Without calling it an empire, human-controlled space slowly expanded. It did not happen through conquest. There were no large invasions or declarations. It happened through connection. When a human outpost established itself in a new system, it would bring trade, protection, and communication. Nearby independent settlements often chose to join these networks voluntarily, not because they were forced, but because it improved their survival. Over time, clusters of human-aligned systems began forming natural borders in space. These borders were not drawn on maps by politicians. They were shaped by supply routes, communication reach, and shared defense agreements. Space that once felt empty now showed signs of organized presence. The Galactic Council did not notice at first. The outer rim was too large and too unimportant in their view. Reports from that region were often delayed or dismissed. Even when unusual activity was recorded, it was labeled as local development or minor resource gathering. But inside human space, things were changing quickly. A new kind of coordination began forming. Not a central government, but a layered system of cooperation. Each cluster of colonies managed its own internal affairs, but larger decisions were discussed across multiple systems. Meetings were held through long-distance communication channels that connected dozens of worlds at once. Decisions were slow, but they were shared. This structure made humans more flexible than before. Instead of relying on a single point of control, they operated like a network. If one system faced failure, others could support it. If one route was blocked, another could take its place. It made human space difficult to destabilize. At the same time, exploration deepened further into the rim. The more humans moved outward, the more they discovered signs that they were not the first to attempt survival here. Some regions contained remnants of civilizations that had collapsed without explanation. Others showed evidence of mass evacuation, as if entire populations had left quickly and never returned. These discoveries raised questions, but there were no clear answers. Instead of slowing down, humanity used these mysteries as motivation. Research stations were built near ancient ruins. Scientists studied energy patterns left behind in abandoned systems. Every piece of information was treated as valuable, no matter how small. What began as survival was now turning into structured growth. Humanity was no longer just reacting to exile. It was shaping its own path forward. Slowly, carefully, and without drawing attention from the larger galaxy, a new power was forming in the darkness of the outer rim. And still, the rest of the galaxy believed humanity had simply disappeared into the silence. For a long time, the outer rim remained quiet in the eyes of the Galactic Council. Their record still marked it as a distant, low-importance region where exiled humanity had been sent to fade away. Reports that came from border scouts were often incomplete, delayed, or ignored. Nothing about that region was considered urgent anymore. But silence does not always mean emptiness. Deep in that silence, human space had changed into something far more organized than anyone outside imagined. What once were scattered survival colonies had slowly formed into a connected web of systems. Trade routes, communication relays, and defense patterns now stretched across large areas of the outer rim. And for the first time since the exile, humanity was no longer hidden by weakness. It was hidden by structure. The change began to become noticeable when Council-line shipping routes in nearby regions started reporting irregular gaps. Supply ships would enter certain border zones and simply stop responding. At first, it was blamed on natural hazards or system failures. Space in the outer rim was known for unstable gravity fields and abandoned debris clusters. Losses were not unusual, but the pattern continued. Entire convoys began to disappear in the same general regions, especially along paths that crossed deeper into rim territory. No distress signals were ever confirmed. No wreckage was recovered. It was as if those ships had simply vanished. The Council sent small investigation teams. These teams were cautious and well-equipped, but even they began to report something unusual. Navigation data in those regions was inconsistent. Star maps did not always match. Communication signals became unstable, as if something was interfering with long-range transmission. Then the investigation team stopped returning as well. This created concern inside the council chambers for the first time in years regarding the outer rim. Still, they did not immediately connect it to humanity. In their view, humans were still struggling survivors scattered across broken colonies. The idea that they could control such organized disruptions was not taken seriously. But inside the rim, humanity was no longer struggling. Human control systems had developed a new layer of coordination that outsiders could not easily detect. Instead of large visible fleets or central command stations, humans relied on distributed networks. Information was shared across many systems at once, making it difficult for any outsider to trace the origin of decisions or movements. When unknown vessels entered human-adjacent space, they were observed long before they reached populated systems, not through traditional sensors alone, but through layered monitoring systems built across asteroid fields, relay stations, and quiet observation posts hidden in plain sight. Human response was not aggressive at first. It was controlled. Unknown ships were often redirected using communication warnings. Trade signals were sent to clarify boundaries. In many cases, intruding vessels chose to turn back when they realized they were entering coordinated space rather than empty territory. But when warnings were ignored, the response changed. not into open warfare, but into silent removal. Ships that enter restricted zones and refuse to respond simply lost contact with the outside. They did not broadcast what happened. They did not send final messages. They just stopped being seen again in any tracking system. This created confusion outside human space. There were no confirmed battles, no official declarations, no visible fleet movements large enough to explain the losses. Only absence. At the same time, human expansion continued, but carefully. New systems were not conquered. They were integrated. Independent settlements in nearby regions began to align themselves with human networks voluntarily. Some did it for protection. Others did it for access to stable trade routes and medical support. Over time, these connections formed natural boundaries across large sections of the Outer Rim. The structure was not an empire in the traditional sense. There was no single throne, no central ruling planet, and no visible capital. Instead, there was a layered system of cooperation built on necessity and trust between systems that had survived hardship together. Inside this growing network, humanity refined its approach to space travel and defense. Ships were designed not just for speed or firepower, but for adaptability. Communication systems were made redundant across multiple channels, so that no single disruption could isolate a colony. Resource management became shared across clusters, reducing the risk of local shortages. The result was a civilization that was difficult to predict and even harder to pressure. The Galactic Council began receiving fragmented reports that contradicted each other. Some said human space was unstable and disorganized. Others said it was highly coordinated and expanding. Some claimed humans were still struggling with basic survival. Others described advanced systems operating beyond standard Council technology levels. The Council could not form a clear picture. Meanwhile, human influence kept growing quietly across the Rim, not through announcement or conquest, but through presence. Wherever humans settled, stability followed. Where instability appeared, human networks adapted quickly to contain it. Without realizing it fully, the Council had created something it no longer understood. The species they had pushed away as a risk was no longer just surviving in exile. It was reorganizing the edge of the galaxy into a structured domain of its own. And for the first time, the silence around human space began to feel less like absence and more like control. The first clear sign that something had changed came when the Galactic Council lost contact with 3 major observation stations near the Outer Rim border. These stations were not small outposts. They were advanced monitoring hubs designed to track movement across entire sectors of space. They were built to see everything coming and going, and yet they went silent one after another. At first, the Council assumed technical failure. Systems in deep space were never perfect, and maintenance delays were not unusual. Repair teams were sent, but none of them returned with useful answers. Their last messages were incomplete, filled with interference, as if something had blocked their communication at the source. Then came something even more unsettling. Trade routes that passed near those regions began to change. Ships that once followed fixed Council-approved paths started reporting navigation conflicts. It was as if space itself had been reorganized. Safe corridors were no longer safe. Familiar coordinates no longer matched reality. Inside Council leadership, concern finally turned into urgency. For the first time since the exile, humanity was mentioned again in high-level discussions, not as a forgotten species, but as a possible factor in the disturbances. Many still refuse to believe it. In their minds, humans have been left behind in broken systems, too scattered and underdeveloped to create anything significant on a galactic scale. But the evidence kept building. The missing ships, the silent stations, the shifting routes, all pointed toward coordinated control in the Outer Rim. And the only known civilization operating in that region with enough presence to influence it was humanity. A formal investigation fleet was prepared. This was not a war fleet, but it was heavily armed and equipped with the most advanced scanning systems the Council had. Its mission was simple: enter the Outer Rim, identify the cause of disruptions, and restore order if possible. The fleet crossed the border cautiously. For the first few sectors, everything appeared normal. Empty systems, drifting debris, and abandoned structures. It looked like the same Outer Rim they had always known. But as they moved deeper, the pattern began to change. Navigation systems started showing small inconsistencies. Signals from long-range beacons weakened without reason. Communication between ships in the fleet developed slight delays that should not have existed. Then the fleet commander ordered a full scan of surrounding space. The results were confusing. There were no large enemy fleets, no massive installations, no visible force that would explain the level of control being reported. And yet, every system they entered felt watched. A few hours later, the first message arrived. It was not a threat. It was not a warning of attack. It was a simple transmission directed at the Council fleet, requesting identification and purpose. The language was clear, calm, and precise. It offered safe passage only if the fleet confirmed intent and followed designated corridors. The Council commanders were stunned. The message came from multiple directions at once, but no source could be clearly located. It felt like the entire region was speaking through one system. After internal debate, the fleet ignored the request and continued forward. That decision marked the turning point. Without warning, their navigation systems were overridden, not destroyed, not jammed in a traditional sense, but gently redirected. Their ships were guided away from restricted zones and back toward open space. Engines still worked. Weapons were untouched, but control over direction was gone. Attempts to regain manual navigation failed. Even backup systems responded with the same outcome. It was as if every possible route forward had already been mapped and controlled in advance. The fleet had no choice but to retreat. When they returned to Council space, their report caused immediate alarm, not because they had been attacked, but because they had not been allowed to engage at all. There were no enemies to fight, only systems that refused entry with complete efficiency. Soon after, more information began to surface from independent traders and distant colonies. They described organized human networks operating across vast areas of the Outer Rim. These networks provided protection, trade stability, and communication support. In return, they required only one condition: respect for established boundaries. Those who followed the rules experienced stability. Those who did not simply lost access to the region. There were no large-scale battles recorded, no declarations of war, no visible conquest campaigns. Yet the influence of human-controlled space continued to grow steadily outward, system by system, until entire regions of the Rim were effectively operating under the same coordination structure. The Council realized something difficult to accept. Humanity had not collapsed after exile. It had adapted. It had studied the emptiness left behind and turned it into structure. It had taken forgotten systems, abandoned stations and broken technology, and built something that did not rely on central approval or permission. And now, that structure was strong enough to shape the movement of ships across entire sectors of space. The final reports from Council observers described it in simple terms. Humanity was no longer just surviving in exile. It was setting the rules of the edge of the galaxy without ever asking to be recognized. And the most troubling part for the Council was not the power itself. It was the fact that they had already removed themselves from humanity's rise and could no longer easily step back into it.